in those schools, we studied Bengali schools, Turkish schools, Gujarati schools, Mandarin, Cantonese, and Punjabi schools. And then we also looked at similar schools in different countries in Europe. So, and what we started to find was that really very differently from the kind of discourses that the government seemed wedded to in talking about English as a specific set of resources which could be learned and tested. In fact, people were using languages in much more fluid ways, and in ways that suggested that perhaps languages aren't really fixed and bounded entities, but actually they're much more fluid, and people use language in a way that is very mixed, and doesn't necessarily pay attention to what we often assume are borders around linguistic resources, so that we name languages. So and so following that, the work kind of went out of schools, because this notion that languages don't necessarily exist as fixed entities, and language is being used in much more fluid ways. Well, I kind of thought, well, if that's happening in these schools, then it's probably happening in communities and neighborhoods as well. So we went out to markets and libraries and sports clubs and community centers and so on. And in quite a large project, we identified 16 research sites in the UK and spent several months in each of those, really recording the kind of language practices that were going on. And yes, we did again find that people, to use the current terminology, I suppose, trans-language, that is to say that they use their communicative resources in whatever ways they can in order to communicate with each other, even when they're talking to people who you wouldn't typically expect to have the same kind of language proficiencies as each other. So yeah, and I suppose you might say, well, those are quite different. That's quite a different sort of research from the language testing for citizenship research. Well, I suppose yes, it is. But actually, if you start with people rather than languages, then it all connects up, because the people in the markets and the libraries and the sports centers are actually the people who are taking the language tests and trying to become citizens. Because often, although we didn't set out to study migrants, because we were interested in people who were speaking languages other than English, they often tended to be migrants who were at some point on that trajectory towards becoming a British citizen. One of the things we really learned by spending several months observing in the market and then in a volleyball club was that much of the communication we engage in, much of the communicative repertoires that we deploy when we're communicating with each other is what we might call embodied communication. And I think this goes beyond gesture, if you like, because gesture tends to be regarded as the kind of poor relation of speech, I suppose. But what we found was that the way that people use their bodies was an integral and fundamental part of their communicative repertoire. So if you think on the volleyball court, the way that people low five each other, they slap each other's hands, either because it's about solidarity or congratulation or sympathy or consolation or whatever it is. It's full of meaning. And of course, in the market, there's a lot of pointing, and I'll have 2 kilos of chicken's feet, and yeah, thanks very much, or even stick your tongue out if you want to order a ox tongue or something. And so that's there all, I mean, just literally all the time. So I learned a lot from working with scholars at at Heriot Watt University in Scotland and at Gallaudet University in Washington D.C., which, as you will know, is the only liberal arts university for deaf and hard of hearing students in the world. And working with those scholars who are doing similar kind of observations to the ones that I'm doing, but they're doing it in deaf hearing communities, really brings home to you how the body is absolutely fundamental as part of the communicative repertoire. In fact, it is the whole of the communicative repertoire because, of course, speech is an embodied form of communication as well. So, so I think that's part of the answer. But also in terms of what we usually call languages, we really found in our observations, let's say in our observations of a customer service assistant in a large city centre library, where people would come to her desk for help from all over the world, because it's a very kind of high profile beacon library, brand new building, so that you'd get tourists, but you'd get overseas students, but you'd also get local people who needed help with finding resources in the library. And so people brought all kinds of different linguistic and semiotic resources into those interactions. And sometimes there seemed to be no common ground in terms of linguistic proficiency on which to move forward. But in fact, what our key participant, who was a customer service assistant, she's from Hong Kong originally. So if she came across somebody, let's say from Brazil, who wanted to join the library, she would find all kinds of ways forward, which were to do with what we might call languages or linguistic features. So she'd find words from Spanish and French, not necessarily Portuguese, but other European languages, and she'd take those forward and kind of create what's sometimes called a space for communication, or you might say a translanguaging zone, people sometimes say now. And you create this space which is characterized by friendliness and conviviality. And the content, if you like, is discussion of these different linguistic features which don't belong in any of the languages of the customer service assistant or any of the languages necessarily, or the primary languages of the client. But they kind of come together in this common ground and create a space in which communication is going to be possible, because the will is there on both sides. And I think that's what translanguaging is about. It's that will to communicate even when the context might mitigate against that typically. And so can we say in that kind of situation, well, that's Spanish, or that's English, or that's French, or that's Portuguese? It seems to me that it isn't necessary. What's happening is languaging or translanguaging in a situation where boundaries around languages don't matter. The point is that there are two people who are using whatever is at their disposal to communicate. And of course, the purpose is that the library user becomes a member of the library, and that happens, and then they can go off and use the library, and everybody's happy. The interaction is concluded successfully. So yeah, so I suppose it may be one difference between the language testing for citizenship work and the ethnographic work is that I kind of feel that when you observe people in interaction with each other, it feels more positive, it feels more hopeful, it feels more optimistic about a multilingual, multicultural, super diverse society. Whereas when you focus very largely on political and media discourses, that can feel quite negative.